real. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin announced his partial mobilization. So over the last 24 hours across towns and cities in Russia, some of the 300,000 eligible reserves started leaving home. It's partial mobilization because for now applies to men who once upon a time completed mandatory conscript service and have combat experience, according to the Russian defense minister. It doesn't feel very partial to the child in the background, though, watching their father board the bus. At a recruitment centre in Dagestan, different emotions. Tempers flare between those called up and an ethnically Russian military official. Given the politics, you have to be brave to take to the streets of the 40 or so Russian cities and towns where people protested against the war and mobilization. There were reports that people detained were being served with draft papers. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov did not deny that when asked about it today. He also reasserted the Kremlin logic for the mobilization itself.
Сейчас де-факто нам противостоит фактически нам противостоит блок НАТО со всеми их логистическими возможностями. Это привело к такой необходимости.
The Peskov family were in the news for other reasons today. Hosts of an opposition radio station claimed to have pranked his son, Nikolai Peskov, by pretending to be recruitment officers, calling him up for action.
Вы 10 утра, естественно, завтра я не приеду. Вы должны понимать, если вы знаете, что я господин Песков, насколько это не совсем правильно, чтобы я там находился. Короче, я буду это решать я буду это решать на другом уровне, если это...
If that was Nikolai Peskov, and we can't be sure it was, it speaks to something bigger about the nature of this mobilization. Look at where the images we showed you earlier come from. The first one is from Nerungri, the Sakha Republic in the Far East. This one is from Blagoveshchensk, which borders China. The confrontation scene with the official is in Dagestan. In other words, so far this stage of the mobilization appears to favour men from the poorer ethnic republics. We have not yet seen scenes like these in affluent downtown Moscow. It could be months before the men being called up now have any real impact on the battlefield. But remember, this is happening because Russia is not winning the war. The mobilization, in other words, smacks of failure, and in the Kremlin that means weakness. The question then, how long will those around the strong man tolerate that?
Well, I'm joined now by our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, who's in President Zelensky's hometown in Ukraine, and our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy, who's at the UN General Assembly in New York. First, Lindsay, so despite President Putin's escalatory actions this week, he's agreed to this major prisoner swap. What do we know about who Ukraine has got back?
Well, we had the foreign prisoners who got back yesterday. That was organised through Saudi Arabia, including 5 Britons now back in the UK, and more than 200 Ukrainians, some of whom have gone to Turkey. It was Turkey that organised this. But most of them are members of the Azovstal regiment. Now, those were the people who President Putin described as neo-Nazis. A lot of the Russian propaganda has been about these men. They were the ones who defended the steelworks in Mariupol. They're seen as great heroes to Ukrainians. But some of the nationalistic Russian bloggers are furious about this because they were told that these people were the worst of the worst and the reason that they were fighting Ukrainians. And yet, here they are. They've been released.
So tell us now about who the Russians got in exchange.
This has made some Russians even angrier. So there are 55 Russian soldiers, police officers and so on. But the main person is a Ukrainian politician called Viktor Medvedchuk, very close to President Putin. So close, in fact, that President Putin is his younger daughter's godfather. And he was really President Putin's way into Ukrainian politics in the old days. But he's not a well-known or popular figure in Russia. President Zelensky wanted them to take him months back. He was arrested here for treason and has been held for some time. The Ukrainians are only too happy to get rid of him. But it seems that President Putin wants him for personal reasons. He's not going to stand trial there as he would have done here in Ukraine. So it's almost as if we're back to Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi, the state is me. And President Putin, apparently at the moment, not making a distinction between his own personal interests, getting his friend back, and the interests of the Russian state.
Lindsay, thanks very much. Well, at the United Nations General Assembly, America's Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged all Security Council members to send Russia a clear message that these reckless nuclear threats must stop immediately, as he put it. Let's get more from Siobhan Kennedy in New York. Siobhan.
Well, it had all the makings of a big showdown at the UN Security Council today. It was a meeting of the world's top diplomats, the Foreign Secretary of the US, Antony Blinken, of France, of Ukraine, James Cleverly. The UK Foreign Secretary was there too, and there was a real expectation that fur might fly because they would be sitting around the same table as Sergei Lavrov, Russia's Foreign Secretary, a day after, of course, Russia threatened Ukraine and therefore the rest of the world with potential nuclear war. But guess what? Sergei Lavrov turned up an hour late. He didn't bother to listen to any of his counterparts. He said his piece and then he upped sticks and off he went. And what he did say in his speech was the usual string of wild allegations about neo-Nazis taking over Kyiv and what he called an attempt to impose a different narrative where Russia is the aggressor. Well, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, I think really crystallized the feeling in the room and in the West when he said this: if Russia stops fighting, he said, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. Well, yesterday I caught up with Ukraine's foreign minister and he assured me that Ukraine would not stop fighting. Let's listen to that interaction now.
We are defending our country and we will continue doing it.
Do you think you can win?
We will.
And what's your reaction, though, to what Putin has said to the deployment?
Quote unquote, that is the level of outrage on the ground, and the Kremlin has a serious problem to deal with. These protests are just the tip of the iceberg. A mass exodus is now underway. A large number of Russians are making plans to leave. Soon after Putin's speech, the flights out of Russia started filling up fast. For the next few days, the flights are completely booked. And these are not cheap flights I'm talking about. Tickets for Istanbul and Dubai are among the most sought after. One-way economy ticket, priced as high as 9,200 euros, that is more than $9,000. And let me say that again, this is not a first class or a business class ticket. A ticket to get out of Russia costs well over $9,000. People are panicking. Listen in now to a passenger from Russia.
Still cannot believe all this happened and why this happened. I speak with you and I'm afraid because my government and police can see it and I will have problem in my country. But I want to say freedom for Ukraine. I want to, please, somebody stop Putin.
That was a Russian citizen who had just arrived in Serbia. Let's now show you what's happening in Turkey. Turkey is bracing for a mass influx. Major carriers flying from Russia are booked till Sunday already. Young Russians are pouring into cities like Istanbul. Many of them want to somehow get to Europe. Listen in to some of the voices.
Partial mobilization is one of the reasons why I'm here. Very poor step, and seems to be that it can lead to lots of problems to lots of Russian citizens.
Mobilization was inevitable because there was a shortage of human resources. I'm not worried because I'm already 59 years old and my son lives abroad. That's all, I guess.
Russians are trying to leave through land routes as well. Again, I have pictures for you. This is the Russia-Georgia border. There was a long queue at the checkpoint. There were long lines at the Finnish border as well. Remember, Finland has a 1,300-kilometer long border with Russia, and these checkpoints are now among the few ways that Russians can use to escape to Europe. Traffic has now intensified there. Finland is mulling new rules. It could limit or stop Russians from coming into the country. Since the war in Ukraine started, we have discussed various scenarios where the war could spill over into Europe. Well, that is happening now, just not in a way that we would have imagined. More people could try to leave in the coming days. How to leave Russia, quote unquote, was the top Google search trend in the country soon after Putin's speech. The question now is, how will Russia deal with this? A crackdown is certain. Already warnings are being issued. The state prosecutor's office in Moscow has spoken out. It has reminded the people about the punishment for protesting. It could lead to a prison time of 15 years. The Russian state had dealt with anti-war protests with a heavy hand. In the first 6 months of the invasion, over 16,000 people have been